I'd like to now welcome Esther Bromley from Support Staffordshire. So Support Staffordshire actually is a fellow CVS over in Staffordshire Way. I thought you'd hear enough of my voice, so we'll bring someone else on rather than someone from our bit speak. And she's going to talk to you about kind of DBS checks.
I believe I have to stand on this cross. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here this morning. My name is Esther Bromley, as it says up there. I'm the Development Consultancy Manager at Support Staffordshire. As was said, we're another infrastructure organisation across the border, covering the whole of Staffordshire. And I manage a small team of consultants who go into charities and organisations and help them actually, well, do things for them, work for them effectively. So go and write policies and procedures, funding bids, that sort of thing, in-house training. So that's where I come from. So far as DBS checks is concerned, I guess I've been around for a long time. You know, obviously the old CRB checks were in force some years ago, and we all went through the change. And when DBS checks first came in, it was quite grey. It was quite hard to navigate who you should or shouldn't DBS check, particularly when we talked about volunteers. It's very clear in some professions, it's very clear in some employment, but so far as volunteers are concerned, it can be a little bit grey. So I'm going to talk through a PowerPoint today. Apologise, there is a lot of words on it, basically because when I usually deliver sessions like this, it's usually a couple of hours, and I wanted to ensure that you've got all the information. You don't have to scribble loads of things down, and that can be circulated potentially afterwards, so that you've got that information to yourself. Okay, and then we'll do some question and answers. So now I can pop this. Doesn't it? Pop it. I haven't now after all this. It's not a problem. Oh. Okay. Is it the right one?
Keep going, just keep going. I'll take that to yours.
Okay, so DBS check. Disclosure and barring service. It is it's a service that helps you as employers or people who are recruiting volunteers to make suitable decisions when it comes to recruiting people. And prevent really those unsuitable people from working with children or adults we would term to be a little bit more vulnerable. It does replace, obviously, or did replace the old CRB, the Criminal Records Bureau checks, and the Independent Safeguarding Authority. So it is all in one now. So they are responsible for processing those requests regarding criminal record checks, deciding whether it's appropriate for a person to be placed or removed from a barred list. We'll talk about that a bit later. And also placing people or removing people from the DBS children's barred list as well, and adults barred list for England, Wales and Northern Ireland. In Scotland, they have their own DBS service. So how did it come about? Well, back in the old days, we kind of blanket checked, CRB checked everyone, and it was thought, you know, if somebody's got a CRB check, it's a big tick in the box. We know that they're safe, and we almost did it to everybody who walked through our doors. So really, from this Freedoms Act 2012, the idea was to create a better balance, really, between us requesting lots of information and making sure that our groups that we work with are safe, but equally, that's sensitive personal information about an individual that really should we be entitled to know. So it's about addressing that balance really between somebody's civil liberties, their rights, but also safeguarding our groups and our service users. Redressing the balance as well between the employer and the state, so that's us as an employer or recruiter of volunteers to make more rounded decisions, to think about more than just this criminal records check. That safeguarding actually is a big process, of which a DBS check or a criminal records check is a small part of it. Reducing bureaucracy, obviously. We all know that paperwork and these sorts of processes that we go through take time, they take effort, and so it's to reduce that on our behalf, to make it easier to recruit people. Bureaucracy as well. I mean, DBS checks at the moment are coming back quite fast, as some of you may or may not know. When they first came into force, they were taking, in some cases, a couple of months, 3 months maybe. So it's a long process to go through. So the idea of the DBS check is for you to think, actually, is a DBS check actually necessary? Okay, so key changes that there have been from September 2012. So more rigorous relevancy check test for when the police release information. What does that mean? So back again in the CRB days, they might have given you information that they think, oh, that could be relevant, or that might just be, I will tell them that, we're not sure, but we'll tell them that. Now they have to say they reasonably believe it to be relevant to the check that you're asking for. So it's more rigorous. New definitions of regulated activity for children and adults, that changed quite significantly, and I'll show you what those are a little bit later. Also brought about provision of statutory guidance on the supervision of children. Again, a document that specifies what you should be doing. Introduction of a minimum age check, so you can DBS somebody at the age of 16 now, and also 18 for a counter-signatory. So those are the key changes from there. From June 2013, changes to the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act led to a filtering of old and minor convictions of cautions, reprimands or warnings. So you won't get that long list that you potentially might have got back in the CRB days. There will be some things that are filtered out, and I'll show you what they are in a moment. The online update service was introduced, allowing those portability of DBS certificates within the workforce. So the workforce is your children or your adults or other. New work for question was implemented, giving the police the information they needed for that relevancy test. So again, it's back to, is that reasonably relevant, and do they believe it to be relevant to the criminal records check that you're asking for? Finally, applicant-only certificates were introduced. So back in the CRB days, you had one as an employer or as a volunteer-involving organisation, and the applicant also had one. Now one only goes to the applicant, so it's your responsibility to ensure that you check it and look at it. What you shouldn't do, what you shouldn't do is take a copy of it, put it away, anything like that. All you're doing is checking to make sure that there's nothing on there that you should be concerned about. What we do as best practice, because we have a variety of different services that we do within our organisation that involves working with very vulnerable groups, we tend to take the certificate number of the DBS check and the date that it was done. And that is given mainly because some of our employees, some of our volunteers go into schools, and quite often they ask for that. There isn't a lot that you can do with that certificate number and date of issue, because they can't go off and check it, but it's there for them to be reassured that those DBS checks are happening. But all you need to do is basically check that that's suitable. Okay, I've said that, so what might be relevant to reasonably believe is relevant. But they can now consider release of information under their existing common law powers, and they do have an independent monitor to oversee exactly what information that they're giving out as well. Okay. So, what will be included? Okay, so for those over 18, at the time of the caution, any cautions less than 6 years ago will be on there. For an under 18-year-old, it's any caution under less than 2 years ago. So that's the cautions. There will be convictions on a prescribed list, so they're very, very serious offences, including sexual or violent offending, terrorism and particular offences lying around children, so kidnap, that sort of thing. They will always be there, they will never be filtered. It will also include when somebody has more than one conviction, it will include all their convictions, regardless of how long ago they were. They will include convictions that result in a custodial sentence, whether they served it or not is irrelevant, and convictions which didn't result in a custodial sentence given them less than 11 years ago, if they're over 18 at the time of conviction, or less than 5.5 years ago if they were under 18 at the time of conviction. So that's what they're going to show. So potentially you could have somebody who has had a caution 10 years ago, that won't show on there. You might have had somebody who had had a conviction 15 years ago, never served a custodial sentence or never had a custodial sentence. Again, that won't show on there, but other ones will. So what will be filtered? So what won't be on there? What will they remove? What's that new Act say? So if there has been 11 years elapsed since the date of conviction, and it's their only conviction, and it didn't result in a custodial sentence, so that will never show. Even then, it will never be removed if it appears on the list. That will never be filtered from a certificate. And as I said, so all the convictions will also be included. Okay. An adult caution will be removed, as I say, after 6 years have elapsed, and it doesn't appear on those list of offences. And for those under 18, the same rules apply, but the time period is smaller. So 5.5 years and 2 years for cautions. Okay. Barred list. So barred list involves us checking those that are barred from working with children or adults with vulnerabilities, and they usually require an enhanced check and a DBS barred list. Now, it is illegal to do one of these if you cannot demonstrate that they fulfil one of those roles that actually requires one. Okay, it's illegal to employ somebody if you know, or let somebody volunteer if you know that they're on that barred list. So you must make sure that you don't do that. You must also refer somebody to the DBS. If you have somebody working for you or volunteering for you, and an action has happened where they have harmed or hurt a child or an adult, and you've sacked them, or if you thought they may have harmed an adult or a child, and you've sacked them because you think that was going to happen, or you were going to plan to sack them because of either of those two things, or remove them, but they resigned first. You have a legal duty to refer that to the DBS service. And that is if, no matter how long ago it was. So I had this question a while ago. Somebody said to me, something happened a couple of years ago. They removed them from a volunteering position because they felt that something was going to occur, some harm was going to occur. Should they refer them? And yes, that's your legal duty, no matter how long ago it is. You must refer them to the DBS service regardless. Okay, any of those bodies can make referrals, and the referral form is online. It's on the government website. It is lengthy. It asks lots of questions. Asks about the person, their age, their name, and their details. Asks about their education and training, what work that they're doing, what their regulated activity was within your organisation, what the reason for referral is to you, to the DBS service, chronology of events, what happened, details of the child and the vulnerable adult, and any documents that you have regarding their time with you. That could be the offer of employment, it could be a contract, it could be their training records, any documentation whatsoever regarding that information, that person needs to be referred to them. Okay, so if you were going to do that, you'd complete the referral form and read the guidance, and the form should be posted to DBS or emailed and given as much relevant information as you can. Okay. It shouldn't stop you from doing your own internal processes. So again, do your investigations, do your disciplinary processes, your resolving problems, whatever it might be within your organisation, but this should be going on at the same time. Okay. So, eligible checks, 3 types. Your standard check checks the police national computer only. Enhanced checks that plus local information, what the local police force in your area knows about that individual. An enhanced and barred list obviously does all of that, as well as checking those barred lists. As I've said, it's a criminal offence to ask for one if you don't have a specific one that entitles you to ask for that information. Okay, so again, you mustn't apply for a DBS check unless you are entitled to do so, and you must tell the applicant why they're being checked and where they can receive any independent advice as well. You have a right to ask that exempted question, that's to give all your convictions, etc., if the role is subject to a DBS. you have a right to ask for all their full and spent convictions. The DBS check has no official expiry date, so again that's a common misconception. It is what it says on the tin on the day of the check, and it is up to you as an organisation to decide when, if indeed ever again, you are going to do a DBS check and to renew that DBS check. And that varies from organisation to organisation. It might vary within your roles. So, for example, with our organisation, we have a lot of voluntary car drivers, and we have a lot of staff who work with troubled families, and we've decided to do them every 3 years. That's our internal decision. In my personal life, I'm a scout leader, I get checked every 5 years. So again, it varies, it depends what you decide as an organisation you want. You may decide, actually, do you know what, your processes are so good within your organisation, you might never want to do one again. You might want to know when they've walked in, you've done that initial check, but actually your safeguarding processes that you continue to do in your organisation is good enough. So that's something for you to decide. If you do carry out a DBS checks in any way, shape or form, you must have an ex-offenders policy. Again, something that's not that well known. So what does that say? It usually says what you would do in terms of if you had an individual come to you and they had something on their DBS check. What would you actually do? What's your policy around it? It could be as simple as something within your volunteer policy, for example, if you're thinking about volunteers, saying a paragraph saying, actually, we will assess every individual on their merits. You might decide as an organisation that what you're going to do is have a chat to them, see how long ago it was, see what they've done since, see what their references are like, etc. See what other things you can put into place and make that decision. But somewhere you must have it written down what you will do. Okay, so portability. Portability is such a good idea. Unfortunately, not a lot of organisations take it up, or not a lot of individuals take it up. But if you did, you can then go in and request a check on a new day. You can accept previously issued certificates. So if somebody came to you and said, okay, I'm applying for a role with children, it requires such and such standard of check, maybe an enhanced and barred check. Actually, I work with children in the Scouts, I have an enhanced and barred check, and it was done last week. Here's my certificate. You can accept that if you wish to. You don't have to go and do your own individual organisation one. But you might want to then see if they have subscribed to the update service, in which case they should be able to give you a number and you will check. But you must do these things. So check, obviously, that their identity matches the certificate. Check it's the right level and for the right workforce, so children or adults. And then do that status update check. So what will it show? First one, it will say the certificate did not reveal any information and remains current as no further information has been identified since its issue. That actually means there's no criminality on there and there's no information, no new information. The second status, would be the certificate remains current as no further information has been identified since its issue. So that means that the certificate does contain some criminality or barring information, but there's nothing new since the check happened. Finally, the certificate is no longer current. Please apply for a new DBS check to get the most up-to-date information. That clearly means there's something new to say. Portability. Okay. So, the regulated activity. So this is whereby you would do your enhanced and barred check. There is a very good document, flowchart I should say, that I've used for a long time, with both of these on now. Go back to my class. Very simple. So this is the children's one. I know you can't really see it, but it starts, does it involve working only with young people, yes or no? And you follow it, and it kind of gives you an idea of whether you should be doing a DBS check or not, whether it's regulated activity. Again, I can send that around if you wish. And similarly with adults, there are six regulated activities with adults. So both of those are very useful documents, and I will leave them here. So the children, unsupervised activities such as teaching, training, instructing, caring for or supervising children, providing advice and guidance on well-being and driving a vehicle only for children. So that's one of the regulated activities. When it says unsupervised, excuse me, it means that you are that person is the responsible person and not being supervised by somebody else who's delivering those different elements. The second is specified establishments, so schools, children's homes, colleges, childcare premises, but not work done by supervised volunteers or contractors. So that's an interesting one. So somebody who goes into a school and perhaps a parent, volunteer, and goes and listens to other children read and sits there in the classroom and is generally with teachers around and they're being supervised, they don't fall into this regulated activity, which is an interesting one. 3 is personal health care, washing or dressing, which again volunteers are unlikely to do that sort of thing. 4 is registered childminding and foster carers, and 5, day-to-day management on a regular basis of a person providing any of those. So a manager, they don't have to be doing those regulated activity, but they do have to be managing it as children. Regulated activity. Move away from the term vulnerable adults, about adults. Focus is now on the activities required by the adult. There's no establishments like there was in the previous one, with care homes and schools and that sort of thing. And no longer a requirement to do a number of activities, certain activities a certain number of times before it becomes regulated. So the 6 of them are healthcare, provided by a healthcare professional or under the supervision of one. Personal care, so you're washing and eating, dressing, drinking, toileting, all those sorts of things. So again, something that volunteers are less likely to do, but they may be assisting with, I don't know if there's a befriender and they help them eat a sandwich maybe, or drink or something like that, but it's unlikely to be for most volunteers. Social work in connection with health and social services, assistance with household affairs, so cash bills, shopping. So again, back to your befriender kind of scenario. Somebody who pops to the shops and get the loaf of bread and the milk, etc. with that cash, again, that falls under regulated activities. Any assistance with the conduct of affairs, power of attorney, deputies appointed under the Mental Capacity Act, that's under regulated activities. And finally, conveying an adult, so driving an adult for health, personal or social care due to age, illness or disability. So, it's quite clear with children and adults when we should be doing an enhanced and bar check, and actually there are, certainly with adults, not that many roles where you would when we're talking about volunteers. So when we're thinking excuse me, about safeguarding and what are all the other roles, they fall into the grey areas, and this is where you as an organisation would be doing risk assessments and deciding. So I've worked with quite a lot of organisations across Staffordshire, including some bigger statutory organisations like the County Council and the Fire Service, around these grey areas and actually who do you or don't you check. What you can do is you can do a standard check if you feel that following a risk assessment you need to do one. So going back to, again, I can leave these here and or send them around. Going back to activities covered under the old CRB. Okay, there's a whole list of them for children and adults, and those of you who have been around doing DBS or checks for a long time will recognise some of them. If your volunteer role still falls within these old CRB regulated activities, then you can still do a standard check if you feel that it's necessary. And I have over the years, quite a number of debates about what roles should and shouldn't be DBS'd. And really, it's about you as an organisation thinking about your safeguarding processes as a whole. So first of all, doing that risk assessment, thinking actually what potentially could go wrong. What could that person do if we didn't have this check? It's thinking about having robust references, so references that really mean something, not how long have you known this individual and do you think they're suitable, but actually sending out a role description and saying, do you think that they meet these requirements? Do you have any reasons why you would think that they wouldn't be suitable for this role? So really robust references. When you're talking to individuals and recruiting them to really, find out what their reasons are for coming into you. To having a really good induction and training programme when they first start with you. To ensure that they know what they're doing and that they're being properly supervised and supported and equally monitored as they go through their journey with your organisation. So all of those things, really important, and actually DBS checks are a tiny part of it. All the rest of it actually is a big thing when we're put together. So when you're thinking about DBS checking so let's say we go back to a befriender, going into somebody's house to perhaps not do the shopping or the feeding or the eating, they're just there to go and have a little bit of a social chat, how are you getting on, weekly visit type thing. They don't fall into any of that regulated activity. You would sit there as an organisation and think, okay then, this is giving somebody quite a lot of responsibility, somebody who's very vulnerable potentially that they're going into their houses, there's a potential for lots to go wrong, but you're also thinking about safeguarding your own reputation as a charity as well as everything else. Do I think that actually our recruitment processes and our supervisory processes and safeguarding is enough, or do we need to do a standard check as well? In that instance, I'd be inclined to say a standard check. Another role might be very different. So, for example, a hospital and perhaps a radio station volunteer who doesn't really come into contact with patients on a day-to-day basis, but may see them from time to time, may take calls from all the rest of it. Do they need a DBS check? I'd be inclined to argue no, they wouldn't. And I've had some debates with our own county council around our community managed libraries, whether they all need to be DBS checked or not, given the roles that they do. So I know that's still very grey, excuse me, but it is about doing those risk assessments and thinking about the potentials for things going wrong, but also, actually, is it necessary or is it a little bit of a step too far to go into doing those checks? Is it necessary? Final tips. So, don't keep any copies, as I've already said. Don't pass on the details of the content of the DBS check to anyone else. Now, this is something that I was asked a while ago, and actually spoke to the DBS check, and they're very useful. If you ever got any queries, do give them a ring. An individual came into us and said, can you please, I've got something quite serious on my DBS check, I know it will come up. Can you please ring an organisation and tell them I've got this? And so they were giving us explicit consent to pass on their details. So I thought, I'm really not sure. I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do. So I spoke to the DBS service and said, look, I've got explicit consent for them, verbal consent. Am I entitled to be able to pass on their information because they feel that they're not able to? And the advice that came back was that, yes, I can do that, but the best practice would be to have written consent from that individual. But also, I have to be sure that the person I'm speaking to on the other side, on the other organisation, is entitled to know that information. So when you do a DBS check on anybody, you don't need everybody to know, it only needs to be one person who makes that decision. In the end, I decided, you know what, I think for me, that's a bit too much of a risk. I can't be sure that the person on the other end of the phone is going to be the right person. So I decided that in this instance we wouldn't do it. But that is a process that you can do if you wish to. Finally, ensure that you're entitled to know the information. So ensure that you've done those risk assessments, that you've that you've gone through the regulated activity, that you're not doing anything that you shouldn't. Okay. I think that's it from my. I'm going to put that at the end. Put this down. Just put that at the end. Are there any questions at all? About from you? Oh, yes.
Are these CRB checks, are they still valid?
CRB, as in old CRB checks. Well, you wouldn't necessarily, I mean, it's up to you if you wanted to accept it, but obviously it would be at least 6 years old now, so that's quite a long time. But
it's mine.
It's yours.
12 years old.
12 years old. That's up to an organisation. Again, there is no kind of yes, no answer with that. It's up to an organisation. If they feel that they want to accept something that's 12 years old, that's fine, but then I would question, why would you want to see something that's 12 years old? It doesn't really have much impact now. And yeah, but it's something that's 12 years old could equally be something that's a week old and still out of date. But yeah, I wouldn't see it as being particularly relevant, to be perfectly honest. Any other questions? Hello?
What happens if the person has been living out of the country, for instance in Canada, for the last 15 years?
It's very difficult then. It is very difficult because obviously the DBS service that we have here will only check what's in the UK. We don't particularly go to other authorities abroad, and in some ways we haven't got that entitlement to do so. So for me, that would be about thinking about, so if you wanted to have that individual come to you, to employ, to volunteer, whatever it might be, to think about what other those safeguarding things that you can put into process, and then go from there. But yes, I quite agree, that's a difficult one.
And what if they offered you a DRB equivalent check from that country?
If they offered you a DBS check equivalent from that country, then I would certainly take it, definitely, and have a look at it without a shadow of a doubt. I might check on the, just to make sure it is genuine and relevant. But equally, yes, you could ask the individual to come into you to go back to their country that they've been living in and see what their process is like. But they're different, whatever country you come from, they're all going to be different and different ways of doing things. So it's not going to be a one-fits-all kind of answer to that one. But yes, but I'd be thinking about the broader safeguarding as far as that individual is concerned. I certainly wouldn't limit them from doing it.
I'm going to take the microphone round.
Yes.
So if you want to speak, I hear you. It's really want to help you.
I was going to ask a bit about portability. We face that quite often where somebody brings a certificate from another organisation. And you mentioned something about updates.
Yes.
I didn't understand that.
Right, so sorry, could you just go back to the first bit? So somebody brings you a certificate from another organisation. Okay. So if they bring you a certificate from another organisation, again, it's up to you if you decide to take that or do your own DBS check. I see absolutely nothing wrong if you have, because I do think it's still a bit bureaucratic, it's still a bit ridiculous the amount of, I have several DBS checks because each individual organisation asks me to do a new one. In some cases that needs to be done because I'm working with different people, I'm working with adults or children or at different levels. But if I'm a teacher and I work with children and I have to have an enhanced CRB check and I come to your organisation and it's the same check is required, then I see no reason why you can't accept that at all, provided that you're happy to do so. So far as the update service is concerned, that is what something that an individual pays to go on. I can't think of the cost, I think it's £14, something like that, in the last 2 years. So it gives you, the individual, it gives a number, a specific number for them, that you can go on to it's an online update service, it's on the Gov website, and you tap in their number and it gives you those status updates. So it gives you today, what does that certificate look like? It won't give you all their convictions and all the rest of it, but it will tell you one of those outcomes that says actually there's nothing new, or there was something, or there never was, or there is some new information, you need to do a new one. Does that make sense?
So if you're saying that the person who does the update is the person who has the form, and then they give their number.
They give the number, yes, that's right, yeah, absolutely. So it's a very useful, and it's something that unfortunately isn't used often enough. So what we have decided as an organisation ourselves is that we pay for everybody who has an enhanced and barred DBS check, we pay that £14 or whatever it is, so that that person can then have that portability and take it around to other organisations. But still, even with that, other organisations will go, no, we want to do our own one. Somehow they feel that's safer, and I'm not quite sure why, because it will give you an update as it is on the day.
One of the issues that we come up with, well, this is sort of almost an annual debate that comes round.
Yes.
We have a lot of nth degree arguments. So somebody's supervised, but they walk off to the loo for 15 minutes and then they're unsupervised. How do you approach these arguments and those discussions when it's brought up? Because we could really do with knocking it in the head, because there's a lot of time expended on those kinds of arguments.
I can quite agree, and yes, I've definitely worked with a lot of organisations that have similar debates, and yes, you're right. But the point of the DBS service and the point of the changes is that it's moving away from that just in case argument. And actually, do you know what? You as an organisation, as an employer or a volunteer or involved in an organisation, a volunteer manager, will know a lot more about those volunteers or employees than a DBS piece of paper will say, because you're making that much more rounded decision. You see them on a day-to-day basis, you're supervising them, you're seeing, you're picking up if things are wrong, you're sitting down with them, having regular support meetings, you're following processes, you have very clear procedures, you know what you're doing. And for me, that is much more important than a check, much more important. So in that status, I would say, if it's a just in case, I wouldn't do it, personally. Okay.
I didn't know that Scotland had its own system.
Yes.
So just to check that the DBS checks that we do in England do cover Scotland as well, as in any activity that happens in Scotland?
It will do, yes, it will show you that as well. But yeah, they have that kind of their aims, but they do talk to each other. So they have just, I think it's DBS Scotland, I think it's called. Really snappily. Any other questions?
No? Are you sure? This is the time. Yeah, here we go. What I would say is there's no silly question.
No, there isn't.
There'll be someone in the room thinking it as well, I promise.
Yeah. My question relates to my own organisation.
Yes.
Well, we don't do any checking as
Okay.
such. We are a lunch club which is run for the benefit of elderly people. And in general they will be in their late 70s through to their 100 plus.
Yes.
So we had a lady who was 102 up to
Wow.
last July. We pick them up in a bus where appropriate and convey them to the lunch club. We provide a meal. If appropriate, if they require it, we deliver them back to their homes. Now, the advice we got 5 years ago when it all started was that they were not eligible.
Yeah.
Would that still apply?
I think when it first came out, I think you're right. I think everybody, because this term came in about it being illegal to check somebody when you're not entitled to, I think it almost went the other way. And you're right, that advice would have been definitely don't check that person. But I suppose for me, the key thing that jumped out to me in that was, you said you're conveying them. So going back to that regulated activity, why are you actually providing that transport? Is it because they can't get otherwise? Is it because they would be isolated without that lunch club? Is it because of disability? Is it because of any of those? In which case, for me, that falls into the regulated activities.
Right, in the case in question, they have to be capable of getting on the bus and off the bus.
Yes.
Effectively,
Which is fine.
unsupported.
Yeah.
So they're not in wheelchairs,
Yes.
they're not disabled as such. We have a driver and we have an escort, so that there's always 2 people involved in the process.
Yeah.
And we advise our escorts and drivers to avoid going into the homes.
Yes.
That's not to say that on occasions they don't.
Yes.
Somebody needs a little bit of help to get in and out of the door or something.
Okay.
But they're advised that for insurance purposes anyway, they're not covered for anything that happens in the person's home.
Yeah. So for me, I suppose it's coming back again to that reason. So we run a voluntary car scheme, for example. We have volunteer drivers who go and pick up people who either through age or disability or other reasons would find it difficult to get about. So that would be taking them to medical appointments, it would be taking them to, you know, anything around the medical stuff, but also it would be about taking people to lunch clubs. So for the social side of it, because otherwise without that we wouldn't get out of the house, they'd be very isolated. So for that, it is regulated activity, there's no doubt about it, because of the reasons that we are transporting them. And so I think for your case, I would say, in your lunch club, I would be surprised if you didn't have people who weren't needing that service for the reasons of social care, for the reasons of getting out and seeing people and being less isolated. So for me that fits under regulated activity, so it would be a yes.
So you would say yes, we should be doing it?
Yeah.
So that would be the fully enhanced?
Yes. Yeah. If those are the reasons, yeah, it clearly fits under conveying an adult. It clearly fits it, besides the lunch club stuff, but yeah, it clearly fits.
Good.
Excuse me.
So, just relating to schools.
Schools, yeah.
Really. School governors,
Yes.
in general, require a DBS?
They do generally, yes.
Okay. And then, I'm involved in a school, I've never seen, I'm sure we don't have an ex-offenders policy, but schools should have an ex-offenders policy.
Anybody who does a DBS check should have an ex-offenders policy, absolutely.
Right, thank you.
Without a shadow of a doubt. Yeah, it clearly says, if you look at any government documentation, it clearly says that. But again, I could count on one hand the amount of organisations I've gone to and go, oh yes, I've got one. They all go, oh, didn't know we needed that. So yeah, it's not unusual at all.
Okay, can you point into a suitable template or a...
Yes, so there is a government, yeah, of course, waiting in the room, but yes, they will have templates. But even so, there is a government design one, but it's all very wordy, as you can imagine a government one would be.
Unfortunately, Bob is one of our trustees, so you all just go back onto CVS board.
Oh, you learn something every day as a trustee.
Absolutely, I agree.
Just a similar question.
Yes.
When we applied to children in need,
Yes.
they asked us the question, are all your trustees DBS checked?
Yes.
And they weren't.
Yes.
Because my rationale was they never come into contact with any of our children whatsoever.
Yeah.
And that wasn't good enough. And we were told they all had to have an enhanced DBS check, even though some of them would only ever come once a month to the meeting.
Yeah, no, I agree. So when you look at the Charity Commission guidance, it does recommend that trustees are DBS checked. The level is dependent upon what activities you do. So if you do some of those regulated activities, which I'm sure you do if you apply for children in need funding, then yes, you can still do that enhanced check. But yes, again, that was a thorny one, and one that over the years has been, should they? They weren't at first, no, you shouldn't be doing any trustee checks, and then yes, you should, and then people with money, and all this kind of thing. But now it's very clear that, certainly from the Charity Commission guidance, that it is. But I would say it's a really difficult one, because when a funder is asking for something that you don't think you're entitled to know, it's really difficult. So I had an organisation I worked with, I don't know, maybe a year ago, who was applying for, I can't remember what funding it was for, but this funding stated that all their volunteers should be DBS checked, even their administrator volunteers. And it's a hard one to argue, because you want to apply for the money and the funding, but actually you shouldn't be DBS checking an admin person in the office. And the argument comes back, oh well, they've got all the details and they can go onto the databases, and well, yes, and you don't DBS everybody out there because they've got access to a database. So it is a difficult one with funding, I do appreciate that. And similarly with statutory partners sometimes as well, who could insist on those kind of more bureaucratic processes. But Yeah, it is. Not a lot I can say that, but as far as trustees are concerned, yes. If you're doing regulated activity, you can certainly do enhanced checks. Any more?
No, I think that's an excellent session.
Well, we're pretty much on time.
Good.
So thank you. I don't, are you staying around?
No, I'm going to have to bother. But what I will do, if you want me to send those things electronically, those flowcharts and the old CRB regulated activity bit, that I can do that, that's absolutely fine, and you can pass it on and put it wherever you want it to put it. Because I found them very useful over the years. And equally, it's gone now, but equally the presentation, which is very wordy, but it's got everything that you need on there.
Brilliant. What we're going to do now, so before David and Rob do their presentation, we're going to have a short kind of 10-minute break, so you can get up, stretch your legs, use the toilets, grab a coffee if it's still hot, or a drink of water, and then kind of move to the other table. So you've got the second table number on your name badge. If for some reason you can't read the number on your name badge, then your name will be on the wall. And so if we kind of have 10 minutes and come back about 22, and then we'll talk about risk management, which I think actually fits quite nicely with some of the things that Esther was talking about. Okay? Thank you. Okay. Management. So as I said, we're going to have two speakers, and we're going to start with David, who's going to talk through his presentation. Then we are going to have a roundtable discussion, but you can also ask questions of the speakers as well. And this is a topic actually that a lot of people think they don't need to do, or sometimes are a bit afraid of in terms of risk management. I know an organisation I talked to quite a while ago who was like, oh, they got to the point of they had to think about what bushes they had at the front of their building because were they too spiky and could children fall in them? And you kind of like, you know, when you say someone's told us we have to take all these bushes up, and I'm like, that's getting a little bit excessive. But, you know, you do need to kind of think about those risks. So I'm going to hand over to David now. I'm going to introduce himself, and then we'll kick off.
It's fine. Thank you very much.
Hang on, have I turned you on?
I've turned you on.
Have you turned you on?
Turned myself on. I think I've mastered the technology. It'll probably all fall apart now, you watch. But, okay, well, good morning. Thank you for inviting me here. My name's David Brooks. I represent a charity called Railway Children. We're actually a local charity based in Sandbach, and our role is to help street children. We help street children in the UK, India, and East Africa, so it's a many and varied portfolio. But my main purpose, as I say, is to talk to you about risk management. Before I do that though, just for my own benefit, could I do a little survey? Could I have a show of hands for anyone who has a risk register in the organisation? Could you put your hands up?
Has one.
Has one, currently in place. Okay, that's interesting. And of those of you who have a risk register, how many of you refer to it more than once a month? One. Well done, sir. That's good. Oh, two, sorry. Forgive me. I think a lot of organisations wrestle with risk. We're no exception. And I think for a good 3 or 4 years we had a risk register that sat there in the background. We didn't really do a lot with it until someone who was offering us money, typically the government or a statutory body, said, "Can we see your risk register?" And then we'd frantically dust it down and think, does this still represent what's going on? Is it still relevant to us, etc. But what I'd like to share with you today is a little bit about risk register formats and how they can be useful, but also how you can use them differently. So rather than being something that stands alone off to the side there that you think about now and again, it's something that you have as a live tool that you use in terms of when you're talking about the important things about your organisation. So how you recruit staff, how you safeguard the people you work with, how you view your level of income and the level of reserves you have, all that sort of stuff should really form, when you're considering those things, you should be referring back to a document, something like this. It doesn't have to be just like this. And it will, of course, be tailored to your organisation as well. So, maybe if I can take you through this. I would say if you've got any questions, by all means ask them as we go along, rather than trying to save them up in your head. This in front of you here, and I think you've got this as a handout in your packs as well if you want to read it that way, or you can see it better there, is it's a work of fiction, to be honest. It's not Railway Children's own risk register. I just invented it just for the sake of this meeting. The reason I did that is if you looked at our risk register, you would be asleep in no time at all, because it goes on and there's lots of stuff in it and it's not that interesting. So I've tried to pick out some of the highlights. And I think what any risk register wants to do is, well, you'd expect it to start at the beginning, which is identifying the risk. That's the left-hand column we've got on there. As you can see, I've picked out a range of risks pertinent to our charity and the organisation that I work for, some of which you'll recognise, some of which you'll think, well, actually, we've got different risks. I think what's important with risk identification is that periodically, maybe once a year or something like that, you're looking at your organisation and the world out there as well and thinking, have we captured all the really significant risks? By which I don't mean everything. I don't mean the child falling into the thorny bush outside the front of the youth centre or something, but the big things, you know, sort of our staff that work with our beneficiaries, young people, etc. Are they well trained? Are we recruiting them properly? Do we have proper lone working policies in place so that they're safe when they're working? That sort of thing. What's our financial situation like? Is our income reasonable? Is the level of reserve in case of bad days at an appropriate level? So once a year it's worth looking at what's the range of risks that we've got? Have we captured everything on there? And you can see a few examples we've got there. We've got safeguarding, we've got income volatility. Data protection was a big one. GDPR's come along. I don't know, have many organisations here been impacted by GDPR? I mean, maybe a show of hands, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it seems to be an all-encompassing thing which has made people think a lot about data protection. And that's a bit of a change of culture as well in terms of how you deal and handle data. So,
can I just ask one
please
question?
do.
I mean, we got slightly confused with it, so we thought, well, we've got to do something.
Yeah.
You can't hear the question.
Here's where we test the technology a bit further. See if it works.
It's not turning on.
So you have a new role, Caroline's roving microphone.
You might need to just
Shall I come and stand close to you and you might pick up this mic here?
Yeah, okay, sure. I'll say it's a partnership.
Okay.
We were confused on what we actually needed to do and not, so we thought we were going to do something.
This GDPR that you're talking about? Okay, right.
It
wasn't a GDPR session, I hasten to add, but by all means try it.
It's sort of come up on there to whisker.
Okay.
So we decided to do something.
Yeah.
We had a website.
Yeah.
And we invited people to join a sort of like a blog link.
Okay.
Where we needed their email address.
Right, yeah.
A bit like what you guys were talking about.
Yeah.
So we assumed that we would have to do something.
Oh, okay.
So that was the only comment.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. I've got you. So
I'm guessing we would need to include it in the
yeah, I mean, in terms of data protection, again, whistle-stop tour of what we did for data protection in 2 minutes, just so I don't take up too much of this time. But basically, we had a review of all our data within the organisation, where it comes in, where it goes to, how we hold it, how we store it, who has access to it, all that sort of stuff. I know this because for my sins as well as being the finance director, I'm the data protection officer. So I get all the best jobs in this place. So we've got that. I have a data protection officer trained and in place, happens to be me for this organisation, and see that staff who handle sensitive data are properly trained, you know. So sensitive data in our case is we have beneficiary information on an online database which is secure, but staff members have access to that. So it's critical that sensitive information about our beneficiaries, which might be where they are, what sort of abuse they've been subject to, who's looking after them, who's a threat to them, that sort of stuff needs to be well contained, well secured, and it shouldn't get into the public domain. So proper process around that, and that involved writing the procedure, sitting down with each member of staff, talking them through it, and getting them to sign it at the end of it. So, have you understood it? Do you understand what's going on here? Not just saying, here's a procedure, go and do it. That interaction, that conversation was important there. So sorry, that was GDPR as an aside. But the important thing there was, let's take it as an example, probability and impact. So actually, can you scroll down a little bit for me, please? Oh, sorry, Bob, my apologies. It's like doing with the bolts, isn't it? So probability is, what's the probability that that risk will occur? Well, give it a time frame. We said next 12 months, so that we might be subject to some sort of data breach. We say medium on that. If the risk materialises, what will be the impact on the organisation? Well, GDPR fines are very significant. I forget what the exact figure is, but it runs into a very expensive sum in the context of our reserves and our income. I think the chance of being fined is low if we're doing the right things and can be seen to have done the right things, but nevertheless it is a risk. So, impact potentially high. Medium in terms of the risk rating. Risk rating is a bit of a weird thing because that to me is how important is that risk to us in the context of how much resource do we want to throw at it, how much time, how much money, how much of our attention do we want to spend on that. And this one we sort of said is medium, so we're quite concerned about safeguarding, we're concerned about income. That's sort of a medium thing that's bubbling away. I think it's reasonably under control. If you go to the right a little bit for me, Caroline, a little bit further. So that's our mitigated risk. So by the time we've done all this lot, we're sort of thinking, well, actually, it's now down at low. We've sort of judged this, we've put these mitigations in place, we've charged who's doing what. So it might be the CEO, the accountant, the fundraiser, etc. So try and keep track of who's actually handling those mitigations. And then we're coming back to, once we've done all the work that we need to do on risk, where does it end up? And ideally, of course, the risk is coming down. Sometimes you can avoid the risk altogether. So an example might be, down at the bottom here, we have risks that the office is broken into. So some inconvenience, but you can insure against that. So that's like you pass the risk on. So you've sort of avoided that risk fairly effectively. But the reality is, if we're working with young people, young children, there's always a safeguarding risk. We can't avoid that unless we do something else. If we converted ourselves to a donkey sanctuary, we've done away with that risk, great, but we're not really fulfilling what we're intending to do. So you've got to accept some of these risks. But it's doing that consciously and sort of thinking, okay, how much are we willing to accept in terms of that risk? Are we doing all the mitigations, all the things to reduce it and make sure that we're keeping it as a manageable sort of thing? Is this making sense to folks? Are there any questions or anyone's thinking, oh, well, would that work for your organisation? As those of you who actually adopt a risk register at the moment, is it the sort of thing that you're doing already? Or are there any sort of observations thinking, well, actually I wouldn't quite do it that way? Or
Well, I guess the reverse or the inverse of the risk, why you need the risk register, is also an opportunity, because if you've got risk, if you don't have risk in your organisation, the organisation isn't going anywhere.
True.
How do you manage the risk and turn it into opportunity?
Absolutely that. And the other thing that might, oh sorry, please go ahead. All right, same thing.
What I just wanted to know was, in our organisation, looking at the probability and the impact, we look at 3 different possibilities. So financial, operational, and reputation. So even when you get to the mitigated risk, it can actually be more than one thing.
Makes sense.
But financial risk could remain high. But the risk of the reputation, damaging the reputation might be lower.
That makes sense. It does. No, that's true. The final thing I'd like to say about risk actually is how we've struggled within our organisation to make it live. And what we used to do was have management team meetings where we talked about everything else, and then we'd have a risk meeting where the same group of managers would come together and talk about risk. And it was awful, basically, to be quite honest, because you'd sit there and say, what's the risk relating to income? And then what's the risk relating to safeguarding? Now what's the risk relating to something else? And it was like frying your brain, you had to jump out of one thing into another and try and think, oh, what's happening in India, what's happening in Tanzania? And it's very, very difficult because you're trying to consider risk right the way across the board. What I've now encouraged staff to do is, instead of that, is to always have that risk register there, or our equivalent of it, at the management team meetings. So if we've got income on the agenda, as we come into the end of that agenda item, we'll say, well, okay, we've talked about income, we've talked about what's happening. What does that mean for the risk register? Now let's say, does that mean that the risk is reduced, or it's higher? It's higher. What else should we be doing about it? So it becomes a live document that you continue to use throughout your management meetings. And it becomes more interesting and more accessible then. So it's an easier way to handle risk rather than looking at it just in isolation. See it in the context of your operations and indeed your opportunities as to how you can actually make the most of your organisation and what you're actually doing. That's about me, I think. Any more questions? Or one more question.
Just an observation.
Oh, observation.
I thought it was interesting that you said going through the risk register,
Yeah.
sitting down with staff and going through training,
Yeah.
getting them to sign it off,
Yeah.
not tick.
Not tick.
No.
Go on.
So I thought that was really good that actually, they're signing off to say, yes, I've received this training and I've understood it, and therefore, that places some responsibility on them.
It does, yeah. We also get the line managers to sign it at the same time. We get the line manager to do the training. And the line manager's committing to a couple of things as well, which is say, I've trained this member of staff. We address this procedure in our one-to-ones periodically. Not every time, but maybe once a quarter, once every 6 months. Just to check it's still current, it's still relevant. And importantly, I commit to resource things properly to enable you to do this, to carry out this procedure. Because it's no good just loading it onto the member of staff if they haven't got the time to do it. So I'm looking for the commitment from the line managers to say, yes, it's resourced properly, yes, I've talked to them, and yes, they understand it. And the member of staff say, I understand it and I will do this. So it's a two-way thing, but you quite like that.
Thank you, David. We're going to swap over, and Rob is going to give us a slightly different perspective. You're right, just to swap the microphone.
Yeah, that's right. That.
Thank you. So, can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. X marks the spot. Right. Okay, yeah, it's really interesting for me to listen to that and the differences really in the way we approach it at Create, which I hope aren't huge differences. So just to tell you a little bit about us, first of all, really, if you just bear with me. Create is a youth and community programme in Macclesfield in Cheshire. It's a community-based organisation. It's very small. Our size is around about 250,000, which is very small for an organisation, really. Given what we do, we're based on an estate in Macclesfield. We do the usual youth and community stuff. You know, we run clubs. We have a music project, and we do alternative education, if any of you are familiar with that. So there are some fairly high-risk activities that we do. We do residentials as well, and we run two social enterprise businesses as well. So there's quite a lot of risk around, really, around what we do. We work to, if any of you are familiar with it, an asset-based model, asset-based community development, which is a very fancy term for really, we look for what's good in a situation, what is strong rather than what's wrong. That's the sort of strapline of it really. So when we're faced with either an individual, a young person who's excluded from school, or we're faced with rioting on the streets, our first mindset, if you like, our approach to it is what have we got, what's good, what can we use here in terms of people, situations, rather than what's bad, what needs fixing. Yeah, and that's the way we work. We've always done it naturally. It's the way we started, and we started like that really because my background was I was living, as a council tenant on the Moss estate. Wanted to be a youth and community worker, and the churches in Macclesfield came along to my estate and said, we want to make this place better, and so I sort of got involved in it, really. So, the whole thing about Create is that it's an asset-based model. We use what we've got, and that is translated, really, into how we approach this organisational risk. We have a sort of a brand that we use at Create, which we call Homemade, because we like making stuff, we like making things up, and we like starting things. And really, what I was reflecting on when David was talking was that was really how we sort of, feels like we tumbled a bit into this idea of organisational risk. We were very familiar with doing risk assessments for those activities that we do, but we hadn't thought about organisational risk. And then what happened was we had a change of our chair. After 10 years, we got a new chair, and she's been our chair for 18 months. And one of the things she did was she said to us, why don't we think about what risks there are to the organisation? And we sort of went, oh, yeah, that's a good idea, I suppose. And she said, well, let's just write down 10 of them. Let's keep it to 10 and see what we've got. So we used no template, okay? We didn't go looking for anything. We just wrote down what we thought were the top 10 risks to the organisation. And that's how we started. So I'm just going to go through them, actually, if that's okay. They're quite wordy, so I might just summarise them. But I'll just go through all 10, and they are specific to Create. And then I'm happy to sort of take some questions and give you some examples of how we mitigate these. I'm just trying to give you an example of how you might want to approach this sort of organisational risk. So, first one is overdependence on one income source. Not unfamiliar to you, but the idea that all the money comes from one pot and that pot might get turned over. And that's an obvious risk to all charities. 2, overdependence upon the knowledge and experience of critical employees and volunteers. So, it's great that we're asset-based, and it's great that we build our organisation around, people who want to do stuff, but if those people decide to walk, we're stuffed. So, so we identified that as a risk quite early on. Reduced support cooperation from St Barnabas Vicar, which isn't a vacant position now, so this hasn't been undated. And PCC, which is Church Council, if you're familiar with that. So we use the church for running clubs. We use it we run one of our businesses from there. So if we put support cooperation, it's a mutual relationship really. The church gets benefit from us because we're around there. Church is closed 6 days a week really, if it wasn't for Create. And there's been no vandalism at the church since we were around. So it's a two-way thing, but of course, if there's a change of personnel at the church and they think we don't want to do that anymore, want to do something else, that's quite a risk to us. So very specific to Create. Unplanned change of Create director. I'm director. I'm not planning to change, but somebody said we should put that there again because I'm founding director. So sort of connected to that number 2 really. That's a risk. Discontinued use of Create properties for peppercorn rent lease. We're very fortunate that all the property we use, we don't pay any rent for it. So we have 3 different buildings we use. If one of those gets turned off, we've got a specific risk around that at the moment. That's a problem. Reduced funding, you'll all be familiar with this. No new contracts or opportunities. Or we've identified another risk is we haven't got the time to submit enough bids. Or it's an interesting one. Existing funders assume Create does not need funds due to reserves cash position. You may not be in that luxurious position, but we operated our finances in a way a bit like housekeeping at one time, which was we thought was good to save, and then suddenly someone said, well, you don't need any money because you've got lots. So, that became a subject that we discussed regularly at Finance Committee. Serious issue mismanaged either by improper practice or lack of adherence to policy. I've got to say, I'm not wonderfully happy about having that there, really, because I see that as it's a management issue, so we should be running the organisation well. I think a lot of the other risks are risks that, to some degree, are out of our control, or less dependent on what we do. And that's why the particular risks, I think, whereas this one, we need to be doing what we do well, really. And I think that's the only risk that's on there that particularly says, you need to run the organisation well. Employee grievance mismanagement resulting into reputational damage. Again, we may not have done anything wrong, but you can't stop people, we've learnt, saying that you have done something wrong. So, do you see what I mean? That's an example of, we can't necessarily control that, but it is a very real risk. So we do need to think about how we can mitigate that. 9 is increasingly hostile, violence, threats and abusive from the community referrals, making Create working environment very tough, stressful to work in. So being a community-based charity, we just about all of our workers, youth workers, and many of our volunteers live in the community. And that can be very stressful if you've got particular families who think you're not doing what you should be doing, or you've taken a particular stance with their children, let's put it that way. So that hostility, becomes very difficult because staff can't switch off, basically. Number 10, serious sexual safeguarding allegation against senior member of staff. Please note again, it's not that we've necessarily done something wrong, it's that somebody has made an allegation that we've done something wrong. And we feel that should be there because it is it's a very live risk all the time, and we need to be conscious of it, and we need to figure out, can we mitigate against that, or how do we mitigate against that? So, we, said when we first started making a register, it can go on and on really, but we decided, with our chairs instruction, if you like, was let's keep it to top 10, and what we do is if a particular risk, a new risk appears, if reports on BBC there's going to be a meteor strike next week, then we would see how we could fit that into one of those 10. So rather than adding risks on, we look at where we can fit a new risk into one of the, how does it fit into one of those 10. And I think that keeps it much more practical and usable. In terms of process and what we do with this, so it's not a dead document, this is reviewed by our finance committee, which meets monthly. So it's interesting what David was saying about possibly using this in our management meetings, which are weekly, so we could think about that. I particularly like it because it makes my job easier, I think. So my director's report to trustees, which is a bi-monthly report, I found that I was writing a lot of this stuff. I was reporting to trustees on what I thought might be a risk to the charity. That's my job as director. This saves me doing a lot of that writing, I think. So what we do now is we update this as those, as our actions, our mitigations change, and as the risks change. And this is, reported to our trustees. The updated register goes to them. So it saves me writing a lot of my trustee reports. So I like that. So that's a tip to you directors, get one of these, it actually saves you work. Because, quite a few of them don't change, do they? Or they change slightly. I think that's it really in terms of how we use it to this point. I've talked quite a lot. Questions perhaps? As I say, I'm very happy to give you some examples either now or in one-to-one later of how we mitigate some of these very specific risks.
Just one comment really on point 10. Surely any safeguarding activity against any member of staff should be a risk, not just a serious point.
Any safeguarding allegation?
Well, it should be anything to do with safeguarding is a risk against any member of staff, rather than just a serious one against senior members of staff.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. Yeah. Any safeguarding allegation against any member of staff is a risk. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, are these prioritised in order, or do you review the prioritisation?
No, they're not prioritised at all. Actually, no. No. Is that okay? Does that answer the question?
Well, yeah, not in my present environment, but in the previous environment, that was one of the things that we were recommended to do by auditors.
Okay.
That we should always prioritise and review. But we had a particular circumstance why that applied.
Right. Do you think that applies to this activity?
I don't know about your organisation.
Okay.
Hello, just a quick question. I was wondering why you don't favour an outdated report, because for your directors and trustees, it's so easy to see at a glance if anything has changed and if any area has been updated. Any personal reason why you don't like them.
Sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
Why you don't like rag-rated reports, because they are very easy to.
Why I don't like writing reports?
Yes, don't like red, amber, green.
Oh no, I didn't mean that. Yeah, no, I'm fine with red, amber, green. Yeah, no, it's just writing reports I don't like. Okay. It takes me so long to do it. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, rag rating is. Yeah, we use it. Yeah, we use it a lot. Yeah, and we use it in supervision. Yeah.
What I think, we're going to move into some roundtable discussions unless anyone's got any final questions. But I think what you need to kind of think about is that risk is actually quite personal to your organisation, and how you want to report, manage those risks. We can provide you templates, but just as an example, as an organisation, I think we're on version 3 actually at the template and the document that we use to kind of manage, report, kind of look at our risks. So, you know, you can go through that process, and it's, for me, it's about making sure that you have got those risks and that you do talk about them. Because even if you haven't got a super big fancy, the document we use actually, to be honest, is quite a big super fancy document. But in reality, as long as you're talking about risks and you've got them written down and you're physically doing something about it, that's the real key part of it. But obviously our two speakers have given you a slightly different perspective because it is unique to you. So what we're going to do now is we've all got a kind of template. Each table's got a CVS staff member who'll do a bit of kind of facilitation. It's just to kind of have that conversation amongst yourselves about how do you manage risk? Is there additional support? You know, if that template, if there's extra bits on that template that you think from CVS point of view you can add to kind of have a bit of a good practice guidance document for people to use, then kind of let us know that. Then after that, I'll do a bit of a summary and we'll close for lunch. So if you want to have conversations around tables at this point. Thank you.
When meetings were, you know, on making sure that people knew what to do. I don't tell them when we're going to be fired. It's all an element of surprise there. It gets reviewed annually. However, if there is an incident that occurs, then we would go back and review that register as well.
But do you have one then that would cover things like lack of income, loss of contract, staffing, everyone with the lottery?
This is something that I'm going to go back and just review, make sure that we do have those things in. Data protection. Yeah, we've got things like income volatility.
Yeah, it's going up and down.
In terms of like head office is vulnerable to crime, yeah, we have those things covered, but slightly worded in a different way.
And those are just examples.
Yeah. We've got things like health and safety, like we had a hot water canister. What was happening if someone was burned from that water risk? So we go around different areas of the actual charity and look at things like slip and trips and falls. And we've got things on the stairs that to make it so people know that there's actually a step there. What would happen if the lift broke down, for example? What are we going to do about it? What's the risk of that? Vulnerable people coming in, aggressive, they get angry. How do we deal with that? You know, how do we train our staff? So we have got, it's quite a thorough assessment that we do. But again, it's something we need to come back and revisit that, especially some of the other areas mentioned here.
In answer to the question, we have twofold really. One is quite detailed operational risk assessment, so that when we take young people or people out to the community, what happens, so there is a breakdown of those operational risks that sit on a database. We are literally just in the process of reviewing the more overarching strategic risks because it was something I felt wasn't as prevalent as it needed to be within the board of trustees. A member of the CVS very kindly lent me their system, and we've then looked at the Charity Commission website has examples, and we've literally just had a new board member who wrote the book on risk apparently, he's reviewing that with us at the moment, and I think the key sound one for me is about embedding it. It's the actual practicing it. Otherwise, it becomes like you just stick it. It's not live. It's not real. It doesn't really relate to anything. It's someone else for it, and then you think, oh, I better dust it off and start. And it's cascading that down through the organisation. So as a senior team, we've just reviewed the strategic risks, and we're going to set up a quarterly meeting where our trustee who heads that up will come. So he'll be our risk champion. Hopefully that will then cascade down, so there's the link between strategic and operational risks, and we embed it so they are reviewed, practiced, acknowledged. That's one of the challenges we have is recording and keeping track of the more operational risks, stuff that doesn't really deserve to be on there because it wouldn't affect the future of the organisation, but equally it's important if it's going to run smoothly. So it's not that everyone needs to know about it, it's the management team, but someone needs to be managing it. And I've not really been scripted in that format. I've not said to my fundraising director, you must have a set of risks on a table somewhere and keep checking it. I've just take the view that you're professional, just manage it somehow. But have you taken a different approach? Have you tried to capture the operational stuff somewhere? At the moment, I've been focusing more on strategic risks. The operational ones, I think, our board chaplain is looking at that with our buildings manager, because the risk assessments operationally are almost sat with him because he's buildings manager, he's health and safety, so it seems almost just to be gravitated towards him over the years. And actually risk is wider than just buildings and health and safety. And I think we need to be empowering and training our leaders within the organisation to get more of an awareness of risk, but not be bogged down by it. No, absolutely. That's the issue, I think. And we've changed because there is that risk matrix in there, which is either 6x6. We're going for the 5x5. Right. Not familiar with that. Yes. There are a number of models around. So, which is your sort of heat map, isn't it? Which you do your score and.
Penny dropping for us. So we started by making that list of 10, and we started writing alongside this is how we might mitigate it. But penny dropping rules was actually, we can just use the same format as we use for activities, because that's how you manage the risk, organisational risk. It's really the same mindset as the way you you manage which is, what is the risk? How serious is it? So we just like copy I suppose pushing through the organisation, and it feels like there's some pushing around through the organisation. Something, I wonder if there's something outside the organisation. I'm not sure that I would want my youth to work to be frankly to be freaked out, talking about a risk and just continue using very positive. No, I want them to contribute concentrate on what we're doing and do that safely.
I think you're spot on
that side, but there's something also about we have tended to concentrate on risks that little control
right,
and I'm not sure that I'm still
I guess it depends on the size and scale of the organisation. So, for example, I manage our database, so there's a series of risks associated with that, which I wouldn't want on the group risk register, but equally which I need to sort of manage. Sort of probably need to be conscious of those and keep them there on the table somewhere, but not on the overarching strategic risk. A little bit like the risks around the river breaking down or that sort of thing, so they recognise someone's doing something about it without, as you say, scaring people, because it's sort of thing, oh, I've got to do all these things, because there is a tendency sometimes to get a bit paralysed by this.
Yeah.
So you look at it and you think, oh,
so to get the stabilised.
So so my risk is
true, yeah, I agree with that.
And also how you then feel the trustee our we have a heat map, we have a single front page heat map on it, and summary of all the kind of risks, and then we've got that and then an action plan against each risk. So there's an element of operational and strategic there.
On the CVS, I think we're very thorough with that, because it's normally discussed at every meeting and that's updated. So, whereas we're only 3 years old and we're trying to chair the community centre coffee shop. So we've done a very thorough risk assessment, and I think to date what we've found is that the operational risks have stayed pretty much the same, because it's things like the kitchen area and the serving of coffees, and none of that's really changed. It's more because we're a young organisation, the strategic risks have moved quite a lot because of generating income and taking on other members of staff and that kind of thing. So that's been quite embryonic. And we do need to review it again. I think the operational one was quite static, because when we did it was like we categorised everything as to whether it was sort of adequately controlled, whether it was outside our control, because there are some things you can't do anything about, or whether there were things that actually weren't adequately controlled, but we could make, like the mitigations here.
Yeah.
So this came out in an action plan at the end of the document that we then worked through in terms of, like, to bring this risk down, these are the things we need to do. And then that got completed reasonably quickly. And to be fair, we haven't really because it was almost like a snapshot in time. I do need to go back and review it, but many things, but the things that needed to be put in place were put in place. It's more for us around the strategic thing that keeps changing.
And I guess that's where we've sort of swapped around the way we use that tool recently, encouraging people to do that, which is when we're talking about where we're talking about, say, really be safeguarding the sort of advocate for the health and safety aspect, that risk register is brought out towards the end of that particular topic. So it says, well, what's changed? Has the action plan moved on because of this, or does it move on? Is it still the same people doing that? Who, as I said, we do that by then, has it been done? So it is making it that live sort of tool rather than something that someone asks for it and then you go and bring it out.
Small things that we do, we look at our register monthly at our team meeting, but it's a specific agenda item, so we will often have conversations, and then when we get to the risk register, like, well, we kind of talk about that, but we don't kind of, I quite like that idea of actually splitting the risk risk register, having to gender our so if they want, sometimes actually through the risk register. It's quite a small thing, just kind of thinking
it's difficult to engage with when it's on its own, because you have to like split your brain up into sort of all the different things that are on it, sort of thing. And I find it I'd rather be considering the risk just after we discuss that particular topic, whatever that topic is, you know, and put it into there. So, and that embeds it within your operations.
We're working towards there being an overarching sort of headline, teaching risks at the beginning, like 5 months average, and then in each one season team's reports that actually aligns with the heat map. So at the bottom, so for instance, housing manager will report on voids so we have information and risks as our two headings, so there's information and narrative, and then risks, we will flag up on risks, and there will be the heat map aligned to that overarching document. So it says, okay, voids is a risk to us this month because we're now 25% voids, or things like that.
Yeah, I like the heat map thing actually, because it seems a nice way of just positioning the various risks on it.
Yeah, and the Charity Week website.
Oh, right, okay. Let's read that.
On ours, we had a column which we found quite useful, which was like who might be harmed and how, because that brought it quite down to the kind of practical level of, okay, well, who is affected by this risk? Because, yes, you've got to think about the organisation, but if you're going to come up with the mitigations or the action, that point of view
the heat map is so we use it pretty much a number of our students, not the staff in it's their number. They're like, how do you put that number? And I'm like, it's just a number on the heat map. How do you put that? And I'm like, no, just the number on the heat map. Because again, and even though we've been using that throughout a year, it was last after the last one, so I sold it to another organisation. And kind of keep exactly like you say, they're generic numbers on the heat map. It's not that I've timed, because we used to have a risk register that had a kind of 1 to 5 risks, and you timed them together to get the overall number.
Which all seems quite subjective anyway to me.
The thing is though, and this is the thing, I don't know, it's one of the things we use on our risk registers when we have a key. So in terms of, if you're using a heat map, because you have to have levels of impact on it. So we do actually have a key that states, it might be that it's a low impact, it's less than 5% on our income, or it's not harming anyone, or it's not affecting our reputation. So do you guys have a section that is something useful for us to add on to?
We have a key. So it gives you time to like keep the impact, and then we do it again in relation to once the mitigation is put in, what it looks like.
And I guess it's scaling impact as well. So in safeguarding, we might have something like, we've got my area, so I shouldn't put it that one, but it might be something like child is injured, child is killed, you know, so it's that range of things, you know, so one's a low, one's a medium, one's a high, but it's actually put on the scale. You can do percentage of variance in income, you can do, I don't know, but it's that sort of thing, it's making it real, sort of tangible in terms of...
Yeah, but the top of the pop scale as well, where it goes up from last meter or it goes down, or where's it going in the charts?
And I've had that on risk registers in the past. There's been one that owns the risk registers in the organisation, I thought, it's just getting too complicated. I just, because after a while you get to the stage where there's that much stuff on it. And then the cry goes up after about, usually every 12 to 18 months, we need a new format for the risk register. And it's usually a sign that everyone's got really tired of engaging with risk. And I think, so this is my revelation, which is the thing, consider it with each topic, is my sort of thinking on that's how to get around that. Because otherwise we have like 6-hour meetings on risk and everyone falls asleep and it doesn't get anything, which is like really trying to move it on, but it doesn't work that well.
I'm interested in how, people identify their way around and what is the risk. So we just came up with a whole bit of less. The things that have really caused us problems as an organisation over the last 3 months are things that were outside our control and we weren't expecting. And therefore my gut feeling is that I want them on the risk register, but then it's trying to look into this sort of blue sky and think, what do you see what I'm doing? And it feels like it's fine, we can have it all in our wonderful formats and we can know what we're doing, but it's actually the thing that we don't see that actually is a big problem.
And it depends what process you go through to develop your risk register. So the good practice is you actually engage every single person in the development of the risk register. Because a lot of places it's just the chief exec, maybe a couple of trustees, and they sit down in a room and they put the risk register together. But actually they should go through a brief process with everybody. And that would then pick up some of the operational bits as well as the kind of strategic elements. I think there's a bit around it. I agree that you should have risks on there that you can't control. There will be risks on there that you can control and that are in your gift and you do know about. What we've done with ours is we've lumped them under kind of certain headings.
So there's a difference there, isn't there, between what you can do something about it and what you don't.
But there's no, if you've got a risk that you think you can't control, so I don't know, it could be that you're an organisation who does entirely outside events, then the weather is something that you cannot control. So you cannot control whether it rains or it's sunny or whatever, but you can mitigate against that and you need to have a plan. So it's spending that time as a team thinking about what are all the things that could go wrong. My staff often sometimes, because I am a bit pessimistic, well, what is the worst thing that could happen? Well, the worst thing that happens is that one of our staff dies. They're travelling out to a meeting, they get in a car crash and they die. Okay, there's an element that I can't control that, but there are bits I can put in place so I can have a policy around you can't drive using your mobile phone, you must have business card insurance, and you must have a driving licence. So as an organisation we have safeguarded as much as we possibly can. There are things outside of our control that actually we have to accept. We've done everything we can to mitigate it, and actually someone could drive into our staff.
Reasonable and practical, isn't it?
Yeah. And actually from a, if it was a health and safety one, the health and safety check will kind of say happiness, something outside of that. And again, there are some things that funding is a weird one, because sometimes people think you should know about funding, but actually we get local authority funding. You could have a new cabinet in, change your political arena, they put everything. You couldn't have planned for that to a degree. You know, there might be things you put in place in terms of developing relationships that give you a voice in, but there's bits that so it's thinking about, we might not be able to control one element of it, but we might be able to control how, you can always control how you respond to something that happens. So it's just thinking about
I mean, I'm thinking about the things that set us back as well was, George Osborne, master stroke, reducing thinking to housing associations. So the housing associations didn't see that coming. I was like, I've seen that coming. And they said, well, no.
But saying which can, so if there's an organisation you potentially could be affected by any change in legislation, then strategically on your risk register you might have a risk that is, what would be the impact on us for significant changes in legislation. Now your mitigation around that might be that actually you just keep up to date with what's happening and then put a plan in, a contingency plan in underneath. But yeah, you can't, you get a new minister in or a new government in, to universal credit, 5 years ago, no, but some of the changes that...
And Manchester's funding reduced, we knew that was like...
I think some of this could form part of a business continuity plan as well. It's not just having a registry, it's like what's your plan, what would you do if the building burned down, that kind of thing.
I'm wondering if this is a small organisation as well, that's what they exist. It feels like being able to access some consultancy really, one of those things that somebody would say, well, this might be that might
and it's one of the things that actually a lot of small organisations don't have the capacity to do that, to be aware of everything that's going on out in the wider environment. And we try and kind of keep people up to date with things, like the GDPR reduction with the sessions and try to support them. But sometimes when something just gets sprung on you, then we're running to catch up as well as everybody else. Most organisations don't have the time, do they, to kind of do that wider external.
I like the heat map thing, that's one thing I'll take away. Next time we ask me to reinvent the format of the risk register, that's probably the way. But I'll keep it in my back pocket
it's quite useful. And so, for me, it's always been about trying to get it really embedded. And when I was at this event last year, there was chief exec from a local charity that talked about risk and how they've got support to implement it. I've got their layout and then sort of looked at it along with the charity commission layout and then thought this is getting a bit too weighty for us and we don't want it sort of stymieing our work. But you do need, and ultimately I want the trustees to be aware of strategic risks. The operational stuff is down to myself and the staff.
I can see a way from that of actually trying to record all the stuff that is a risk that we're managing but doesn't need to feature in the top 10 basically. So I think that
and we are trying to get to a point where there is a maximum of things 10 as mentioned earlier, or that we only show them the risks that are actually changing from one
because I sit there in risk meetings and say, oh, we need a risk for that, and I sort of say, well, which one are you taking off? Because people are very good at adding risks. They're not so good about taking risks off. And I'll say to them, I want it all on a page. It's got to fit on a page. And then the CEO's answer to that was, well, if the trustees say that sort of it wasn't considered that it doesn't fit on the page, that's not a very good idea. But there's actually a serious point behind that, which is you've got to focus on the key risks. You can't prioritise everything. So you just kind of get that across to them.
I think, because I'll get the team to share our event, because we do have that initial front page which has the headers of all the risks on them, what they were last month, what they were to start off with, what they were last month and what they currently are, so we can track and show the changes, and we have the heat map kind of on there. But I think one of the things I've tried to do is it's about thinking about what you were kind of talking about thinking about your headers, and if something else comes up, actually does it become an action or a mitigating action under one of the existing risks rather than adding a new risk. It's about that strategic document that goes to trustees
absolutely.
Is it fit for purpose in terms of, well, actually, if something random comes up, we know some random things could come up, is that going to fit within one of our risk headers, or do we have a risk header that says how do we respond to things that come up that we don't understand? So it's kind of, because you can get, we used to use an Excel spreadsheet, and start getting massive, and see it on the page, and we have a Word document now, but even that's quite a big document. So I think it's that kind of, how do you kind of make it more of a document that does fill people with a 27-page risk document with like 57 risks in it that, you know.
It comes analysis paralysis.
Getting paranoid.
As well.
I think if I've understood you right, you know, this is connected to operations, you know, personal responsibility. So I like that to keep in mind as well, because you have to refer to it.
And it is that kind of, so if you are going to look at it monthly, what you're going to do monthly, just kind of look at the colour and go, that's the same. You say, well, we said we were going to do those 5 actions to mitigate against that. You can't do everything straight away, can you? So, you know, how is those actions going to evaluate the actions under the risk? Under the risk.
And I think that's the value of the document, isn't it? When you start to focus on mitigations, it becomes more live again, sort of thing. We said you'd do X by then, have you done it? You know, and then you say, oh, well, actually, you know, I've done it. And that becomes more tangible as a document. Oh, that's good. It's reinvigorated about risk, isn't it? May not be good for
I know DBS checks and risks, they're not on paper the kind of 2 most exciting topics.
No, really.
But they're really critical actually for governance and organisation, and you know, the dry topics are often the hardest ones to kind of sell to people, but actually the ones that have, you know, like saying we have whole conversations over the numbers on the heat map that don't actually mean anything. And it was interesting when she was talking about DBS and in terms of sharing. So if someone discloses to you and says, can you disclose to this other organisation? Because that is something we have. And we have conversations quite a lot that if we know about something, do we share it? Or not? Even without that person's consent, do we? Because we feel we have a duty of care in terms of to the organisations, and it's their conversations we have all the time. It's always a challenging one to kind of do that.
And there is a GDPR gets out on that somewhere, isn't there?
Yeah, safeguarding.
There is. GDPR, so I'm desperately trying, so we've got a relationship with the ICO, because they're based in Hounslow. So we're going up there, and I'm desperately trying to get them to do some training.
That would be brilliant. That would be brilliant.
So we're going to get into there, they're doing some volunteering stuff for us. So a few people we've got a mentoring opportunity a little while ago, so a few people got mentors from the ICO. So I reckon at some point next year I will get one of their staff to come out and do some training, but we are going to do a session on data protection and GDPR, and not to be so, people are getting really scared about it now, kind of going, GDPR, and I'm like, you need to stop doing that. It's getting silly, but we are going to do one of the seminars we'll have, particularly kind of cyber security as well. So the GDPR actually is around security of data and consent, and then you've got data protection as well. So that's the other thing everyone's forgotten. There was a revised data protection in 2018 that everyone's just like, let's forget data protection, let's focus on GDPR.
I was we were victim to last year, a couple of years back now, whereby someone got in, I think Eastern Europe, they literally locked all our server down and all our files down, and put a ransom on it. And fortunately we have enough stuff which is either on the cloud or on the server to be able to maintain operations going. But the end result was engaging an IT firm in Glasgow who specialise in unlocking these things, to unlock them. That makes you realise how difficult it is. It's about £5 to get that done, to get us back running. It's about 48 hours.
Because in reality, most of us aren't going to be paying money for like you know, the big companies' security they have, but actually a hacker with a half decent amount of skills could get into our data, you know, and we haven't got the funding to be paying all the levels of security that, you know, some people want us to be out there getting around. You know, but it's about, but from an ICO point of view, they'll want to know that you put processes in place, because actually, you know, big companies get hacked all the time. So if they get hacked, the government gets hacked. What's the plans? That's what I always say to my just these other people. You have to make sure you're proportional and reasonable to the amount of time you're holding. 1 minute warning, and then we're going to do a bit of a summary, and then we're going to have some lunch.
What was ironic was the gentleman almost slipped and tripped a minute ago. Which caught my eye and made me slightly swear. He was alright. It's all's well that ends. We've had within the YMCA Federation, because we're all independent, autonomous organisations. Right, okay. So in this country there are 119 YMCAs. And there's been a number of cases where there's been a message that's come through an email that's almost purported to be the CEO saying to the finance director, please transfer this money. And a number have been stung. Really? Yeah, a number have been stung by it. It looks so legit. Right, okay. But, yeah, quite worrying really. 21,000.
I'm going to pull everyone back, because while there is no food there, we're expecting it imminently. It's always hard, from an event organiser's point of view, when there's lots of conversation in the room, they always kind of feel a bit bad saying, like, stop talking to each other now. We've invited you here to talk to each other, now stop talking to each other. But mainly because I'm suddenly in the wrong place. Mainly because, you know, we want to get you some food, and there will still be the opportunity to kind of talk to each other, have a bit of food, kind of swap some contact details, have conversations with people. There's a couple of points from the DBS presentation. So just to say, in terms of, because I think one of the things I was quite keen to have conversation around the DBS session was around the fact that most people, when I spoke to them, didn't realise that they could make, or that they should be, and that they could be making disclosures into the service. I think there was a mindset around it was basically the same as CRBs, but by a different name, when in reality we've heard this morning it isn't the same as CRB with a different name, but actually you do have a duty to make disclosures, because it isn't just about the criminal record. That's what it is, it's disclosure. So if any of you think, oh actually we had an incident a couple of years ago, or we had something this year, or we've got something currently, and you feel a bit kind of concerned, then come and speak to us and we can help you through that process of making that referral. We will, you know, if you haven't got an ex-offenders policy, we will make sure there is a template ex-offenders policy on our website, and then you can kind of go to that, tweak it, make sure it's relevant for your organisation. Just some just some pointers. We've got quite a lot of policies and templates on our website, and we update them regularly and we make sure they are fit for purpose as a template. Just some tips. Take our logo off the template. Okay? We had quite a few people kind of bidding into the council, and I said to the council, what are some tips for people when kind of for this next round? And they said, oh, well, why don't they should make sure that the policies are fit for their organisation. And I was like, did they just use ours with our logo on? And she was like, yes. So please do personalise them. But we'll make sure as next offenders one up there. We'll make sure that all of the documents that Esther talked about this morning, that all the slides are circulated and sent round. And we'll also be kind of sending out a little electronic evaluation form. Please tell us what you thought about today. This is the first in a series of events, so if we've got something massively wrong, tell us. We want to know. If we've got something that you thought that was great, then again tell us. We do want to know about that. We're not going to kind of do feedback from the tables, but just from my table, I think we had quite one part of the key conversation we had was around embedding risk in your organisation and making it a living document, and at what levels do people kind of get involved in risk. So, for example, at our management team, we do look at the risk register monthly. So the staff are engaged, we report to the trustees, they're engaged, but actually from our conversation I think there's a few things we could do better as an organisation. I think there's always things you can do kind of better or you can tweak. If following the conversation today you think actually we haven't got a risk register, and even though we've got the template we still don't know where to start, come and speak to us, that's what we're here to do. We can even help support, facilitate a kind of risk session within your organisation. There's lots we can do to kind of help, so it isn't just about policies. We can come and talk to you about the best way to do things. So yeah, I think that's from me. So I want to thank you all for coming, and there is now food at the back of the room. So please do use the business cards as well, and share your contact details with people. Thank you.